Welcome to Running It Back, the Lessons Learned from Sports podcast. I'm Mike Palmer, joined as always by Tarlin Ray. Tarlin, how are you doing today?
So whenever you ask that question, I always feel like I need to share. I'm an oversharer just with
Yeah,
you and
yeah,
with all of our fans. This week was interesting. I had my vaccine, my second dose. Please, everyone, if you have an
yeah.
opportunity, get a vaccine. People have
Jab,
different opinions, but I got mine.
jab them if you got them, is what I like to say.
Yes, I've probably not the best parenting moment because when you both get the shot at the same time, what
Yeah,
happens if you get sick?
that's POTUS and the vice president. They don't fly on Air Force One at the same time. This is
Exactly. Different
against,
bunkers,
yeah, yeah.
same thing. So my wife, unfortunately, 12 hours in, she got sick, low-grade fever, sweats, everything. So I was on duty 6 a.m. Tuesday, helping the kids, how do we get them to school, et cetera, et cetera. I then broke down around 1 p.m. in the middle of a meeting where someone, as a 90-person Zoom call, someone chatted me, said, perk up. And I said, I'm dying on this call. So it's a real thing. Full body aches, thought someone was jackhammering in the back of my back, low-grade fever. I go from feeling real pain, and I can't even imagine anyone who went through COVID and has recovered. So just a lot of empathy. But start with that, excited to be vaccinated. And the other great news is I'm getting my haircut today.
Wow.
And that may seem like a small thing. And I've thrown no shade at my in-house barber, being my wife, who did a dutiful job. But I'm really excited to go to a professional haircut. I never ask you how you're doing, but I just told you how I'm doing.
That's good. That's good. And I'm doing well. Weather's coming around. I'm half on my vaccine regimen. I have the other half left. But yeah, like we say, running it back, jab them if you got them. If you're thinking about a vaccine, you should do it. But yeah, man, and spring's upon us. I have a 2-year-old. We run around in the park together. It's all good. But we're here to talk about lessons learned from sports, Tarlin, and we're talking about quarterbacks. Black quarterbacks in particular, and with the NFL draft being days away at this point, we wanted to think about Black quarterbacks in the context of the NFL draft, and we'll begin maybe talking quickly about what's going on in the 2021 draft, and then start to run it back across the span of years. Many different quarterbacks we're going to be talking about and different contexts depending on the draft year. But it should be an interesting topic. It's and we've done a little bit of homework, so we'll probably be hopping around the back catalog pretty quickly. But any thoughts as we kick it off on this topic?
Yeah, I'm pretty disappointed as I think about the drafts coming up and knowing that most pplayers need to take the Wonderlic, that we didn't Wonderlic ourselves. That would have been fun to share with our Wonderlic. For most don't know, it's almost like an aptitude test that all athletes, prospects take. There's a little stink to it because there may be some racial bias and other things, but they would lean into the Wonderlic test, believing that based on your Wonderlic, especially as a QB, it'll help determine whether or not you can read defenses. And
especially, I believe, especially for a QB1.
For a QB1. By the way, I think Ryan Fitzpatrick, who, if you remember in the last show, is in the Mount Rushmore of Harvard athletes, may have one of the highest Wonderlics ever, and now is a QB1 on another team. Outside of that, we look at this draft, it always was coming down to Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields. Trevor Lawrence, for those who remember the Titans, he is Sunshine reincarnated. Thank you. Of one of my favorite movies of all times. Clemson QB since his freshman year, and Justin Fields, 3-time starter at the Ohio State, because I get confused by the Ohio State in Washington. So always coming 1-2. Justin Fields in 2019, the Ohio State team losing to Clemson in the semifinals by 6 points. Justin Fields having a redemption story in this year in semifinals, throwing for 6 touchdowns and crushing Clemson. And so what's interesting is to see how these players who you got their game on tape, you can see how they perform, their stats out there, how they've been pulled apart. It's interesting to see who's still standing on top and who's trailing as we come to this draft moment.
Yeah. And Trevor Lawrence, soon to be Head and Shoulders spokesperson. That's a prediction here.
They're about to fire Troy Polamalu.
I think they'll add him to. I think Troy's under contract, so I think they'll add Trevor to the bit, but he is the white quarterback. He is the quarterback who's understood as the number one pick. And then a lot of the conversation from there shifts to Fields, when Fields isn't even necessarily going to be going second based on a lot of the draft intelligentsia talking about it so far. Zach Wilson likely to be selected second. But the drama here is about Justin Fields versus Trevor Lawrence, and which of them has the right level of motivation and work ethic, which is another element of the slights against Justin Fields, who's the black quarterback in this scenario, that maybe he doesn't have the fire in belly, maybe he doesn't have a chip on his shoulder. And then Trevor Lawrence recently came out to say, and I'll quote him here, "I don't have this chip on my shoulder that everyone's out to get me, and I'm trying to prove everyone wrong. I just don't have that. I can't manufacture that. I don't want to." So the predominant consensus number one pick, everyone knows he's going to be drafted first by Jacksonville, is saying, I don't really need to prove anything here. I don't really need that. And then meanwhile, his work ethic is not being questioned so much as Justin Fields. Is an interesting context to put out there if you are looking at this through the lens of race. And as we ran it back to the history of black quarterbacks over the years, particularly in the first round of the draft, there's a long history of questioning them in a number of different ways. So it is interesting to see that coming out in this year's draft. And yeah, so thoughts, where do we want to go from here?
Yeah, just a quick thing on the Trevor Lawrence take. He then thought he was being misinterpreted and said he has a lot of confidence in himself and in his work ethic. He then says he loves to grind and that he's internally motivated. Mm-hmm. And work ethic, said it, words came out of his mouth, grind, immediately, okay. I think they're like, oh, I understand what you're saying and got it. You're that guy. Justin Fields has not come out and said that, is not getting that pass. He's got Dan Orlovsky, who, and I should have looked up Orlovsky's stats. He's god awful quarterback, hot garbage. Said that there are guys in the know that are saying he's the last in to the locker room and the first out. And they're questioning his work ethic. Mm-hmm. That another one, just looking up articles, and granted, this can mean subterfuge. This is just what happens in the drafts where people are trying to position themselves and say, I'm not going to take a player. The other thing is that he has no friends. Since he switched from Georgia to come to Ohio State, he has no friends. This is a 3-time starter. This is a workout. This is a guy, if you watch the semifinals against Clemson this year, he almost thought he got into a car wreck. He got hit so hard into his ribs and his hip and thought he was out for the game. And yet came back into that game in pain, throwing for 6 touchdowns and to beat the guy who stood up on a podium and said, I don't need to prove anything to anyone. Yeah. So it's an interesting contrast. And then before we run it back, you also then have players, and we've talked about this even in the Steph Curry show, players who haven't put up the tape, who may have had 1 year like a Zach Wilson, who are now head and shoulders above Justin Fields. So just the other thing that people say about Justin Fields is he has accuracy issues. And Justin Fields in his 2019 campaign, when the full season was going, he had a 67% completion percentage. Okay. 41 touchdowns, 3 total interceptions, just pretty dominant year. This year, let's go back to work ethic and caring. He was on the front lines as a Big Ten player, trying to get the league to actually play this year in a COVID year. So he was one of the faces of the Big Ten. They only got to play in 8 games. Ohio State had to shut down for weeks at a time because of COVID protocols. And yet he had 22 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and then he upped his completion percentage to 70. Compare that to the guy who now is the number 2 pick, or supposedly number 2 pick. 2019, he had 11 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. and a 62% completion percentage. And this past year, he had a chance to play in more games at BYU. 12 games, 33 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and a 73.5% completion percentage. All right. It's okay.
Yeah.
But how does a guy who put tape out there for 3 years, leading one of the dominant teams in the country, get taken down so fast? So yeah, I just wanted to put a pin. I look forward to watching draft, see what happens, but it's crazy to me. And as we run it back, maybe we'll get a chance to understand what's happening today.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting about the draft is that particularly around quarterbacks, there's a lot of busts. There's a lot of quarterbacks who come in, are drafted in the first round. There's a lot of hype. Maybe they have a great scouting session, or they come from a less competitive conference, so there's less data about them. To your point, maybe they've only played a season or two and somehow they're in the draft for whatever reason. And frequently the scouts are wrong. Frequently the insiders who know what to do in terms of the NFL draft make a lot of mistakes. And particularly around quarterbacks, as we begin to run it back over the years, there are cases where quarterbacks are not drafted high. Famously, Tom Brady was not a high draft pick and is arguably the greatest quarterback in the history of the NFL. And so it's an example that there's a lot of thinking that goes into the draft process. There's also a lot of both hedging and swinging for the fences that happens as well. So frequently teams will draft players with higher upsides in the hopes that they hit a rock star. And then the flip side is sometimes, particularly depending on where you are in your franchise's development, you may choose to draft a more steady, safe bet, quote unquote, to insulate against the fact that this quarterback might be a bust. There's a lot of veiled language that then gets connected to that based on whether the quarterback's black or not. And then the history of sorting black players into positions other than the quarterback, particularly wide receiver. There's a lot of history of black quarterbacks who wind up playing wide receiver, or wide receivers who could have probably played quarterback but weren't really given that opportunity. And it does make me think of Tom Brady. Tom Brady was either going to be a quarterback, period. Like there was no alternative. He wasn't going to be a wide receiver. Kordel Stewart, who was famous as Slash back in the 90s, wound up playing a lot of wide receiver and or running back. And there are more athletic quarterbacks. Frequently, black quarterbacks have the ability to play other positions. And then frequently that was used as a way to keep them from being in the most intellectually complex, shout out to the Wonderlic, position is the quarterback, but also the leadership position, the position that's responsible for making decisions on the field. There's a lot of either veiled and or vaguely explicit knocks on black quarterbacks over the years, most recently Lamar Jackson, as to whether they should in fact play quarterback or whether they should play another position.
So you hit on to one, Kordel Stewart, and I had totally forgotten about Slash. And thank you for bringing it up and giving me like 37 seconds to do some research and try to bring my memory back to 1995. But truly one of the more dominant players in college football out in Colorado. It's still one of the great highlights that you'll see if you're watching an NBC or CBS Saturday morning football, the Hail Mary at the end of the game to beat Michigan to Michael Westbrook. I think it was 64 yards. But when Kordel came into the draft, he refused to be labeled any other position. He wanted to be drafted as a quarterback, which is why he fell out of the first round. It's interesting, the team that he went to in Pittsburgh, Cowher was salivating. He wanted to get him on the field. Kordel at that time was playing behind just some of the most dominant quarterbacks you've ever heard of. Neil O'Donnell, Mike Tomczak, and Jim Miller. So his fourth round quarterback that he wanted to get on the field, finally Kordel said, I will play any position. And so that's when Slash, QB, wide receiver, and running back. And that's Cowher doing that. What's interesting is Pittsburgh has done that more than any other team. Hines Ward was a quarterback. Antoine Randall L was a quarterback. So it's interesting to think about Kordel because I think it actually is his perfect analogy is to think about Lamar. And Kordel wanted to be drafted as a quarterback, and so did Lamar Jackson was the Heisman Trophy winner, I think as a sophomore, if I'm not mistaken. Had a junior year, which wasn't as dominant at Louisville. I can never say it, but I'm trying. Louisville, but still was an outsized talent. The challenge with, and we see that the NBA draft, which you spoke about, is there was a prototypical quarterback, 6'4", statuesque, scan the field, not very mobile, and I got to be able to see over your line.
I think it's the mental model of old films of Johnny Unitas. You're thinking, this guy's got to look a little bit like Johnny Unitas. And no, much love to Johnny and his family. I'm not knocking him, but it's a little of a stilted kind of old school, because then Peyton Manning, basically same idea.
So what I give to Ozzie Newsome at the time and John Harbaugh, who actually stopped Lamar Jackson's fall in the draft and took him at the end of the first round, was they drafted the quarterback. He was sitting behind the statuesque Joe Flacco. Sitting behind Flacco, who's running a different offense. And what they did when they unleashed Lamar Jackson is they ran an offense that fit his unique skill set. And so I think the challenge is you look at a player, and I think some of the great coaches will adapt to the individuals they have instead of always forcing the talent into the system that they know. So Lamar was the MVP of the league because they allowed him to be slash 2.0 without playing receiver, but to allow him to use his legs, allow him to use his arm, and didn't call him a dual threat quarterback, just called him a quarterback.
Yeah, exactly. And it reminds me a little bit of a lesson learned here on the parenting front. It's parent the kid that you have, not the kid that you want. And it's in this context, if you can build your team around someone who has transcendent talent, and you have that flexibility and creativity in terms of job design and structure so that your team can still function, but you can really optimize around people's assets, and then also be innovative in the mold that they may ultimately fulfill. To your point, build the mold around the player rather than have the player try to fit a mold. And that's really the history of this, as we did go back through the years. The one that we probably need to, the granddaddy of them all, I would think, would be Doug Williams, which we've talked briefly about in the past. But in 1978, taken with the 17th pick by the Tampa Bay Bucks out of Grambling University, he didn't necessarily have a transcendent career from that point forward until he won the Super Bowl. But the fact that he did win the Super Bowl with the Washington Redskins with a really heroic performance. Also, his scouting reports at the time talked about his leadership ability, which is another frequent knock against black quarterbacks, that they're not going to be able to get the locker room behind them. I think Doug Williams delivered on that leadership piece when they won the Super Bowl. And that did begin to change the game a bit, but it's a very slow progression. If you do look at these first round quarterbacks, black quarterbacks, there's a pretty lengthy drought from Doug Williams until really the 1990s to begin to get other black quarterbacks drafted at the top of the draft class. And in some ways, that's perhaps because there hadn't been an example like Doug Williams who had gone all the way to winning a championship, because there is that perception in the NFL that to win the Super Bowl, you're going to need great quarterback play, and you're going to need, at a minimum, leadership from your quarterback. And I think that was the veiled knock against black quarterbacks for a very long period of time. In fact, there were some points when it was less veiled. But any thoughts about the lineage here and the history of this? Like, where would we start, and your thoughts on Doug Williams?
Yeah, I stopped in the mid 90s, just looking at from 95 basically to now. Last year, of the 63 first round quarterbacks taken, 20 were black.
I believe that's roughly a third.
Well, there's some names like Doug Williams will ever be the first Black quarterback to win a Super Bowl. We have Steve McNairs of the world who won MVPs along with Cam Newton. Mike Vick, who's the first Black first pick quarterback, his first pick in the draft. And then you have some busts and the EJ Manuels and the Achilles Smiths and the Andre Ware, who's probably ran one of the most dominant offenses in Houston back in 1990.
Jamarcus Russell.
Oh my God, about Jamarcus Russell. I don't know why. He's on my list right here. I can't remember the name of the grape drink that he loved to drink.
I think it was the purple drank.
Purple drank.
Yeah.
That he couldn't get enough of, which I feel...
It was on brand at LSU.
An outsized talent, hard to get around some issues on the outside and also inside. But he's not. You might as well point to Ryan Leaf. Ryan Leaf is Russell. They're a bust, and it happens. Fascinating to see the number of Black quarterbacks. I do think the breaking point potentially was in the 1999 draft, where 8 of the 13 quarterbacks taken in the draft were Black quarterbacks. There were 3 first rounders taken that year, which has never happened again. Keely Smith, so the Oregon, who was throwing up numbers pre-Chip Kelly days, throwing up some numbers in Oregon. We had Donovan McNabb from the Cuse.
Yeah.
Who would go on to the Eagles and get battered around by Eagles fans.
Oh my God. We're gonna return to McNabb. I have some thoughts. Yeah.
All right, but Andy Reid and then Daunte Culpepper, who will always be top of my list because as a Vikings fan, we actually threw up some numbers for a few years in the Randy Moss days coming out of Central Florida before he tore up his knee. Yeah. So that was an amazing moment for the NFL, just because you're more willing to see a Black quarterback, and they've often used this word as the CEO of the team, and they're willing to lean into that talent.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I do think 99 is a really interesting year. Donovan McNabb, just to pause on him, I think he is the most undercut, gaslit, microaggressed against Black quarterback in the entire history. From my perspective, growing up as a New York Giants fan, so I follow the NFC East pretty closely, but just the veiled digs against him throughout his career with the notoriously tough press and an even tougher fan base.
And a Wonderlic score of 15, that it was the same as Jim Kelly.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. And these are the fans who famously threw ice balls at Santa Claus. The guy showed up to welcome the fans at the Vet in Philadelphia for a Christmas game. It's very cold and there was ice, not even snow. Yeah, ice balls, and they're pelting the poor dude who's out there as Santa Claus. But McNabb continues to get digged even by you, Tarlin, where he was drafted ahead of Achilles Smith with the second pick. But you talk about the bust ahead of McNabb. And then when he could have won the Super Bowl, he's playing with T.O. So like it's not exactly like it was handed to him. And then but also how he managed his media presence, I think was very different from, say, Daunte Culpepper, who also is on the Mount Rushmore of fantasy football quarterbacks. So like he had some stats that won some people some fantasy football chips back in the early 2000s. But Culpepper to me was more behind the scenes and there wasn't as much of a bullseye on him. It is interesting to look at these quarterbacks who generally made it. There is that notion of weathering that they're going throughout their careers, where they're just having to, the whole concept of being gaslit or microaggressed against is that they're small things. Maybe you don't really bring them up, but over time they take a toll. And your point about Justin Fields is similar, where for him to perform at a higher level, there's more resistance that he's going to have to power through to still have the resolve to be truly great. And you contrast that with Trevor Lawrence. This is the whole concept of suffering from affluenza. Like he has no resistance built into his life. He doesn't understand as much the privilege that's been part of him. So maybe does he lack some of the motor? I don't know. But I do think there is a level to which the psychological work that needed to be done to break through here for each of these quarterbacks, even to be drafted to begin with, but then to actually have an NFL career, I think is an important thing to note.
2 notes on the Donovan, one on Donovan McNabb, and then Justin Fields. We can't leave out one small item which could give pause NFL recruiters. But Donovan McNabb, what happened? So I know T.O. he literally is playing on one leg. He's just a dominant Super Bowl. And the Eagles are driving to try to win this game. And it's just curious. Donovan McNabb, I think he threw up in the huddle. Mm-hmm. It seemed like he was going at half speed with no urgency. So just curious. That's just when he friend of the show.
Was it his flu game? Was it the other side of a flu game?
But then there's a whole story that he went out before, which is terrible. So anyways, maybe that was flu game. With Justin Fields, we've spent more time talking about the work ethic comment because that is something I'll be bantied about when you talk about black quarterbacks. He does have epilepsy. He's dealt with it his whole life. He's had no issues or episodes while at Ohio State, and many of his family members have just grown out of it. So that is a legitimate health risk concern that can come up, but it pales in comparison to other things that are being talked about. I do think as we talk about black quarterbacks, and we like to run it all the way back to just finding the gems, we have to give a shout out to Bernie Custis, who was the first starting black quarterback. And this is in the CFL. The CFL was a much more open environment, racially friendly.
Canadian Football League.
There you go, Canadian football. In 1951, in the U.S., and I was going to jump. We will come to what is the gym that you have, but the other first starting quarterbacks were Marlon Briscoe and James Harris, and the AFL was a lot more friendly as well. The NFL, surprisingly, under influence of the Redskins owner, George Preston Marshall, was less open to racial diversity. And I'm glad Dan Snyder is carrying on the Redskins name and honor as you continue to harbor some tendencies. And then the CFL continued to have some great quarterbacks, and one being Warren Moon. He won 5 Grey Cup championships for...
the Edmonton Eskimos.
There you go, for the Edmonton Eskimos. And I actually do believe, if you run it back, Warren Moon was one of the guys, and I know Doug Williams won a championship for the Redskins, where someone could see that's the guy that can actually, black quarterbacks can lead, MVP. Can sling it, and can be the CEO of the team. But I know I've given a little color around starting black quarterbacks in the lineage, and I want to get to 2020, which was a seminal year, but you found it even the sort of a gem of gems, one of the first guy who played in the NFL.
Yeah.
Who was that?
A gentleman by the name of Willie Thrower.
So his last name was Thrower.
His last name was Thrower. Willie
Not
Thrower?
Runner, Thrower.
Thrower. Yes, Thrower, exactly. Although he was known as Mitts. So because he had big hands. So if you're known as Mitts, you would think maybe he's a receiver.
Yeah, not catcher, not Willie Catcher.
Not Willie Catcher, but yeah. So yeah, and he was known to toss a football 70 yards. He famously was called into a game in the NFL. And here's a quick excerpt from the news of the day. In the 10th minute of the period, Joe Perry fumbled and Dick Hensley recovered on the 49ers 16. Willie Thrower, former Michigan State Negro quarterback, star, making his major league debut, passed to Jim Dooley, putting the ball on the 4. George Blanda and Fred Morrison came into the game with a resounding raspberry. They wanted Willie to put it over, but Morrison did it on a blast off tackle. The boos changed to cheers. So that
right there, 1953 was the first time that a black quarterback played in a game, and that is, you're reading off the news highlights or the editorial from that game.
Yes, and just to be clear, we may have the Willie Thrower story in development as another Running It Back production. So hit us up if you're interested in working on that screenplay with us.
Right, that's called Deep Cuts. There's a subscription to the Deep Cuts, and we're working on that. So if we cycle from what we're talking about, what's going to happen in the draft, and I'm definitely curious to see what happens in that first round. I like the moments where kids have worked so hard and it's changing their story arc. So I will watch. It's a must-see TV for me. And then we cycle back to sort of those seminal moments whether it's 1988 for Doug Williams, 1999, where three of the first round quarterbacks are black, 2001 with Michael Vick. And then you start to, even outside of Doug Williams, you have black quarterbacks winning Super Bowl, and Russell Wilson 2014, Patrick Mahomes in 2020. Get to a major moment in 2020 at the start of last year's campaign where you had 10 black quarterbacks. And it is the Dak Prescotts, who of course ended up injured, Patrick Mahomes, Russell Wilson, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Tyrod Taylor, who famously was injured when someone paid off the doctor to puncture his lungs so Justin Hebert could take over and be a fantasy stud. Cam Newton, who played for your Patriots.
Not mine either.
And was massively ineffective, but still a starter. Dwayne Haskins, who was waived because midseason in a COVID era, he threw a party where there might have been women wearing his jersey in what was not a socially distanced way. Teddy Bridgewater, who was in and out, was a little effective, 2 gloves.
He may be headed to Denver. We'll see where he winds up. He's still trying.
They'll still get a career together. And I still have will always, as a former Viking draft pick, have a little love for him.
Yeah.
And Deshaun Watson, who was very effective, but who knows if he'll ever play again. But 10 quarterbacks. Did you do the math yet?
That's
20
a
of 63.
good chunk.
10 of 32. It's pretty close to the
healthy portion.
Third, close to the third. Okay.
Roughly a third.
So the times are changing. And what you're seeing is coaches adapting as well. The game is changing, understanding how effective you can be when your quarterback is multidimensional, can read the field, can make all the throws. And we hope to see, for me, a continued openness to the person who is considered your CEO, the person who's supposed to lead the team, a person who may not, I know he's the GOAT, may not be on the sidelines screaming at his assistant coach and screaming at his team and saying, look at that leadership. Right. Where if that happens for a black quarterback, that it's seen the same way. So I do think there's progress. I'm curious as to the Justin Field moment, because it's a moment to see whether or not you're taking a step back or taking a step forward.
Yeah. As Terrell Owens famously said, that's my quarterback. So there is an element to which everything revolves around that role. And you can't help but analogize to how hiring practices can and should evolve. We talked about the Rooney Rule and head coaches and similar biases, even more deeply entrenched biases, I would argue, around head coaching positions, and even more so as you go up the chain into leadership positions and particularly ownership of NFL teams. It is something to continue to look at, because I think it is a place where it's so visible that we can't help but think about what it signals in terms of how we're supposed to run a workplace and how we're supposed to think about giving people hiring opportunities. So I think there's a lot to draw from in terms of lessons learned and analogies. I'd like to conclude at my end of the conversation with one black quarterback known as Byron Leftwich, who was drafted 7th in 2003 by the Jacksonville Jaguars. And he had a good, but not great NFL career. He had some good seasons, never really got Jacksonville where they needed to get to in terms of winning in the playoffs, really. Playoffs. But then most recently was highly regarded by Bruce Arians as his offensive coordinator and someone who worked very closely with Tom Brady when he came down to Tampa Bay and then led that offense with obviously Brady's help, but was able to design something that really won them the Super Bowl. And now he's still seeking out that head coaching position. But I do think the quarterback will likely open up first so that folks like Byron Leftwich will have the opportunity to rise in the ranks as a head coach, hopefully, assuming that's something he's pursuing. And I think there's a lot for us to draw from there as we think about, particularly if you're someone who has the ability to hire folks or think about seeking difference, helping folks who maybe traditionally haven't had an opportunity, and then also potentially rethinking what leadership roles look like to build around the talent that you have, rather than maybe your old mental model of who's supposed to be in that position. So I thought that was a good lesson learned for me. And I wanted to make sure Byron Leftwich, friend of the show, at least on this end, we'd love to have you on, Byron.
He's my friend. I just haven't told you I know him.
Oh, excellent.
But I will never, I'll say this. I wish we weren't recording. I'm really impressed with that poll. I'm really impressed with that lessons learned. I think out of all the deep research, to point to Byron Leftwich, who was the CEO of the players in a way, because he's leading that team, and then to have a chance to rise to be basically the second command and be a CEO of a team, he will be along breaking that ceiling and what the model is. Kudos to you for that lessons learned. I'm excited to continue the conversation. To your point, not only the ways you look at sports, but the ways you look just at hiring folks in general, the way that you assess people, and the way that you understand how to, as you talked about, the right people being in the right seat on the bus and allowing them to really thrive. Here's to Justin Fields not falling deep in the draft. Look at the tape.
Yeah.
He should be a top 5 pick.
Don't snooze on Trey Lance either. North Dakota State represented. But last thought, you're going to bring it home right here.
You said Culpepper had the greatest fantasy, one of the greatest fantasy players. I still remember my buddy's team was called Moss Pepper, because he drafted Culpepper and Moss back to back, and he literally was dominating. But don't forget Michael Vick, and he was just a stud. Yeah. And I can't leave without saying and giving a shout out to one of the guys in the early days when there was very few black quarterbacks, in Randall Cunningham, who survived the Eagles and then put up some of the most dominant team numbers in 1998 for the Vikings. So shout out to the history of all black quarterbacks who helped get the league to where it is in 2020 and beyond. And thank you. It's always fun to run it back.
Yeah. And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. Let us know what you think. There's plenty more stories to tell in these lists that we've been looking at, whether it's Willie Thrower or Kordel Stewart, or plenty of the more rising talent now. If you think about what Patrick Mahomes in particular may wind up being remembered as, it's some really interesting conversations to have on this topic. Let us know where you want us to go with this, because I think we're going to continue to dig into the stories of some of these quarterbacks, potentially going into some of them like Mike Vick with some more depth. But if you like what you're hearing, tell a friend, subscribe, do all the good things. Follow us at Running It Back FM on Twitter. We'll be back again soon. This is Running It Back.